Radio. Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to the first Center for Advanced Media Studies talk of the new academic year, and it's great to see such a nice crowd here. I'm Al Stavitsky, Dean of the Reynolds School. If you're not familiar with our CAM speaker series, every month or so we bring professionals, sometimes scholars, from around the community or around the nation to the school to talk about emerging issues in journalism and mediated communication. And we're also, when we have visitors to the school for some of our other speaker series, we try also to have them give a CAMS lecture as well. And that is the case here because you're going to meet today our 2016 Diversity Fellow in Residence, Tristan Ahtone. The Diversity Fellow in Residence program was established by the Reynolds School to bring to campus professionals and thought leaders to illuminate issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion in the realm of mediated communication. And so we're at the start of a 3-day visit with Tristan. Looks like should I step down here so I'm step back? Okay, we'll minimize the feedback here. So we're at the start of a 3-day visit that includes not only this public talk, but numerous class visits, engagement with faculty, with members of the professional community, and with tribal leaders later this week. So the idea of this Diversity Fellow program is not only someone comes to campus and gives a talk, but also has an opportunity to fully engage with a number of constituencies. So we're very grateful to our funders for that program, the Charles H. Stout Foundation and the McClatchy Foundation for enabling us to bring our Diversity Fellow to campus. So about our speaker, Tristan Ahtone. An award-winning independent journalist based in Albuquerque, though widely traveled around the world, as I'm sure you will hear. Educated at the Institute for American Indian Art, is IAIA is the acronym, so we got that right, as well as Columbia University. Has worked professionally with Wyoming Public Radio, KUNM Public Radio in Albuquerque, with Al Jazeera America, the Newshour with Jim Lehrer, as well as Vice and numerous other news organizations. He is in the leadership of the National Association of Native Journalists, and is really one of the leading Native journalists in the nation. So we're very fortunate to have him on campus as our Diversity Fellow, and also to give our first CAMS talk of the year. So let me get out of the way and turn it over to Tristan Ahtone.
Hi. There we go. Okay. Hi. Yeah, my name is Tristan Ahtone. I'm a freelance reporter based in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and a member of the Kiowa Tribe of Oklahoma. First wanted to say thank you to the Reynolds School for bringing me out. Thank you to Dean Stavinsky here. And also acknowledge the traditional territory that we're in now of the Washoe people, to thank any folks that are here in the audience right now for allowing me into your territory and homes. The talk that I want to kind of give today is reporting in Indian country. We say do's, don'ts, Pitfalls and Benefits. I'll be honest, it's actually kind of a lot of griping, but it's educational griping. So hopefully we'll learn a little bit here. But what I like to do first, when we do this discussion here, is do just a little word association right up front here. So when we see this word here, Indian, I want people to just kind of throw out some ideas or adjectives or words that you think of when you hear Indian. What does that? What kind of images does that conjure for you? Don't worry, this is a safe space. You're okay to be, a little racist because we're going to talk about it afterwards. So. Original. Other ideas. What are some of the things that come into your head when you hear Indian? So in India, okay.
Tribes.
Okay. Okay, either y'all are more enlightened than most people usually, or you're a little more afraid to say what's on your mind. So.
Sports teams.
There you go. A couple more.
Andrew Jackson.
Toronto.
Genocide.
One more.
Casino.
Casino. Okay, we're gonna come back to that and continue with the interactive part with our Indian pop quiz here. So, first off, can anybody tell me who is an American Indian? How do you define a Native person?
Either one of these two.
Person who is born within a certain tribe, but also born into that mindset of what they are, where they are, and then also that hidden culture, that silent culture of how we regard people around us, what we eat, what we drink, how we walk, how we dance. See those things, there's different rings within that. That's Native American.
Yeah, that is correct. There's also a very clear term that you guys can keep in mind, an area when you're doing your reporting, is that a Native person is somebody who's enrolled or a citizen of their tribe too. Now obviously there are some shades to this, and we can talk about this at another time, because there are federally recognized, state recognized tribes, and then tribes that have no recognition at all. But one of the first things that you can always ask when you are interviewing people who say that they are Native American or American Indian is, are you enrolled? It's very, very clear in federal guidelines that the federal government doesn't recognize you as a Native person unless you are an enrolled tribal member. So you might have a Cherokee grandmother or princess in your family, but unless you are a citizen of that nation, technically you're not Native. Now again, there's some gray areas on this. This isn't a hard and fast rule, but for people who are just getting into covering this area, it's a pretty good one to stick with, to start with. Next one. Does anybody know how many tribes there are? Throw out a couple of numbers.
Around 500.
Okay. Anybody else?
562.
Okay, we got a Native in the room. Cool. Who else? Okay, yes, that is correct. It's actually 567 right now. 567 federally recognized tribes around the U.S., not counting state recognized tribes either. So you've got a lot of diversity and a lot of different groups out there. Another one. Do most American Indians live on reservations? Yes or no? God, you guys are smart. You're right. More than 60% of Native Americans live off the reservation. So when you see a lot of coverage in Indian country going to the reservation and whatnot, it's actually less than half of the experience that reporters are reporting on when they go to these communities and try to do stories there. Remember that you've got over half of your other population that are living a very different sort of life than what you might be thinking of in cities. So we're going to play a little bit of video here, if we can get this to work. And this is from ABC News here, classic video. We're going to watch just a couple of minutes, though, not the whole 6 minutes here, but give you some examples of some reporting.
Meet an all-American kid, quarterback of his middle school football team, president of the student council, and one of the strongest students in his class. A 12-year-old with a face arcing back to those warriors of the Lakota Sioux past, like Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, James Lonell. A boy who has their face and is trying to find their strength. His name is Robert Looks Twice. His long hair an Indian symbol of honor. And at the tribal dance, he has mastered the fierce precision to every beat of the drum, the hunter echoing the movements of his prey. On a freezing afternoon, I meet him in an isolated corner of the reservation, and he takes me inside the trailer where he lives with his grandmother, his uncle, and 8 cousins.
Hi, Diane.
How are you?
Hi, Diane. Hi, Diane.
Very nice to meet you.
That's my cousin DJ. Here's my cousin Gage. Kiana, Trayden, the little ones, Adam.
It's so cold, they often have to turn on the propane stove for warmth.
This is our kitchen. Our floor, we got it like this, and it's messed up because, as you can see, it's getting ready to cave in. And our roof, you can see it's very bad. Right there, it keeps leaking, so it's like a trash bag there. It's messy, but I just got up in a rush.
We have no lights, we still have to get some
We
lights.
still have to fix the ceiling, but that'll cost a lot of money that we can't fix it for free.
As many as 5 kids live in this room.
Rainwater comes in here
Clothes in the closet, often wet from the leaks.
from student council.
But somehow Robert always sees a distant horizon.
I got a jacket.
His name comes from his great-great-great-great-grandfather, who looked twice, looked for the right path. And Robert tells me how he tries to find a quiet corner in this room so he can study. He plans to be the first in his family to go to college, and after that, what is your goal for yourself?
I want to be the first Native American president, and that don't happen.
I'm not laughing because it's impossible. I'm just laughing because it's great.
Okay. There's a lot of problems with that particular piece there. It's mainly been, as I'm sure you all are familiar with the term, has been compared to poverty porn. Essentially, is that when I said there was 567 tribes in the country, for some reason, maybe many of you are familiar that Pine Ridge Reservation exists, but it's very odd that reporters continue to go to the Pine Ridge Reservation. Like, every reporter has to go to the Pine Ridge Reservation. And I have no clue why, when there's like 566 other options that you could go to, but you keep going to the same place. So, ABC went over there and did their little piece on Mr. Looks Twice there, and basically hit every single stereotype that you can possibly hit to put together a story, almost all of them. But it's called the 4 Ds. It's this rule called 4 Ds. And I didn't come up with this one. A gentleman named Duncan McHugh out of Canada did. And I'll share some of his information later. The 4 Ds are how Indians make television and news. And that's drumming, dancing, drinking, or dying. If you are drumming or dancing, it's a great way to get into a story. Never mind what the dance or the song or anything is, but it's a great way to get into your story if you have some Indian music and some flutes, as you heard on the last one. If they're drunk, even better, because we always like a drunk Indian story. And the other one is dying, which is really the most pervasive one that I'm seeing today, is that tribes are dying, languages are dying, cultures are dying. If it's not dying, then it's not news for some reason. You'll even see, I can't remember the name of the photographer who's been traveling the world doing photos of tribes called Before They Pass Away or something like that. And it's this very, very common theme that you see in all sort of coverage, is that you've got these 4 Ds that people really like to hit a lot. And that's a really good way to get on television if you're a Native person and you can fit into one of those. There are a number of tropes, and there are a number of ways that people kind of get into Native coverage, and you see it a lot when you just kind of thumb through. Another trope that you're always kind of looking at and seeing in stories are the victim. Always the victims of history, the victims of colonization, the victims of whatever. We play really great victims. The Crying Indian knows. You always want to play the victim there for your reporters that come. And reporters are really good at kind of painting that image, the victims. Another one, a little more complicated, is the image of the warrior. Everybody loves to see those warriors that are fighting for their people, and they're fighting for their rights, or they're fighting for whatever. You know, there are people out there that are legitimate activists that do what they need to do. There are also people that know that you, as reporters that have never reported in Indian country, don't know the difference, so they play that up. Like, it's very, very easy for Native organizations to take advantage of reporters because they know that you don't know what a warrior is or isn't, but it looks really good, and you're pretty sure that he's walking between 2 worlds, and that makes him a really interesting character, so we need to talk to that guy, and play up how he's a warrior for his people. So this is a very, very common one that you see. Another one that you see quite a lot are the folks that are involved in ceremony and the religious stuff. I mean, there's this whole New Age kind of a thing where everybody is really interested in Native religion and Native ceremonies and stuff like that. And I always get the sense there's a number of reporters out there that do cover Indian country, and sometimes I meet some that just have this really strange sort of awe, like this. They kind of meet you, and I'm like, oh, yeah. You wonder if they're about to ask you if you talk to animals and stuff like that. And we do. I talk to my cat all the time. He doesn't really talk back. I'm not sure what that conversation is, but you get this sort of mystical sort of feeling about that these Native people have some sort of answers to these cosmic questions that we just don't have. You see it very, very commonly. Another one is violence. The Natives are violent people. There's violence everywhere. They're just killing each other left and right. It's red on red crime kind of a thing. So, this is another one that you see a ton of in coverage of Indian country. It's always violence. And the final one that you see quite a bit of are statistics. That Native people are essentially just statistics. And the one thing that's interesting about statistics is that there are a lot of bad statistics out there when it comes to things that are happening in Indian country. One thing that you always want to remember is that it's a really small sample pool, so things get really weird mathematically really quickly when it comes to those kind of statistics. But also that the fact that then when it comes to statistics is that they're not the sum of the experience, and they usually don't bring into context how people got into these situations in the first place, that there are a lot of historical forces, a lot of things that are going on a federal level. There are a ton of things that are going on in people's lives that really impact statistics. And statistics, as you will find in your careers, always make for great stories. New statistics are out on something, you want to jump on that, you want to incorporate that into your reporting, put a feature together. But obviously we all know statistics can lie, and particularly in Indian country, it can be a really, really big problem. So for example, back in 2012, the New York Times came out to the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming. At the time, I was a reporter with Wyoming Public Radio, and one of my primary beats was to be out on the Wind River Reservation as well. At this particular time, the Obama administration had ended a program that they had nicknamed the Surge, where they'd put a lot of police out into reservation communities to try and bring down crime numbers and stuff. So the the surge had ended, and the New York Times came out to take a look at it and what had happened. What they managed to do was come out and paint a picture of the reservation. As you'll see here, the dropout rate was 40%, twice as likely to kill themselves, child abuse, pregnancy, assault, violence are endemic, alcoholism, and drug abuse. This is essentially every bad thing that could possibly happen in a community. They've been able to sum up, and a lot of this stuff does happen. The problem with this is that when you kind of put all of these things together, is you sort of forget that, especially when looking at violence on the Wind River Reservation, is that when you look at statistics here, Native Americans do come into contact with violent crime at double the rates of the nation, but almost 60% of victims identify their attackers as white, which is really kind of interesting when you say that there's a violence problem that's going on in Indian country. Another thing is that between 2005 and 2009, over half of violent crimes that took place in Indian country were declined for prosecution by authorities. So that means if you get assaulted, maybe you're one of that 60% that got assaulted by a white guy, maybe it doesn't go to court anyway because they're not going to prosecute. So you've got this kind of general state of lawlessness. And then the other thing that they forgot to kind of mention is that, which had been reported on frequently, and even the New York Times had reported on, was that between 1943 and 1982, the Wind River Reservation essentially had all of its oil and gas stolen, and the tribe never saw any money of this massive oil boom. So it just turned this community into what could have been a very thriving economy, into a reservation, into a place where there was a lot of hopelessness and a lot of people were taken advantage of and essentially had their resources stolen out right from underneath them. These are really important facts when you're summing up that there are a lot of problems on a reservation. These are like super important to kind of keep in mind, but a lot of times reporters are not looking at that and not really paying attention to what was going on in the past and how we kind of got into this situation. So it's all sort of important to remember. So how do you find stories and get away from a lot of these stereotypes? Again, these are all stereotypes that you're saying. You're saying stereotypes that a lot of writers are using to move their reporting along. Indians on horseback conjure a lot of images for people. Indians doing things conjure a lot of images from westerns and things that you've grown up doing, playing cowboys and Indians and that kind of stuff. It's brings up a lot of images of people sort of stuck in a different kind of time. And it's really easy to write a good lead to your story when you've got some, feathers or horses or something like that. It's a lot harder when you actually have to take a look at what people are doing in their modern lives. It's a lot harder to write a lead about, a Native woman sitting in front of a computer working on, code or something like that. These are much more difficult and much harder for people to write and kind of wrap their heads around. One thing that I've advocated for in the past has been hiring more Native reporters. There are a lot of good Native reporters out there. Mainstream newsrooms could really use that kind of expertise and use those people to really, improve their coverage. But I think what the big thing to really keep in mind here is that when you have all of the stuff going on is that it's important to be able to make a commitment to reporting in Indian country. So that means being able to come up with ideas on how to focus in your reporting, how to make that a part of your daily coverage, how to do that with the reporters that you have, and how to bring in reporters that can do that. It's a massive sort of social and cultural change to have newsrooms start thinking differently about how they cover communities of color. But when it comes down to it, I think we've all said in the past that hiring more reporters of color is important for newsrooms. But while I agree with that, I think it needs to go a step further in saying that there's got to be some sort of commitment that those reporters don't need to be sought after. Those reporters will come to you because you have an atmosphere that is going to encourage their work and make them feel like they are part of your newsroom and make those communities feel like they are important to your sort of news coverage. Now, this here in the U.S., I feel like this sounds like a sort of crazy idea sometimes, but in looking around at other parts of the world, for instance, in Norway with the Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation, it's part of their corporate charter to actually create content that strengthens indigenous culture there in Norway, Sweden, Finland. The photo here that you're seeing is a character called Binny Banish. I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but it's part of a new kids show that they're rolling out there along with all of their other lineup, where the show is essentially Sesame Street in the indigenous Sami language there. And it's rolled out at the same time as all other programming in Norway. So Norwegian kids see this stuff as well as the Sami do. They've got time when it comes to their news broadcasts, and it's integrated into how that country produces their news and how they treat their indigenous populations. Another one is in New Zealand. They have Maori Television, which is also a publicly funded television service in which it's broadcast in both Maori and English, and they do some amazing sort of programming, everything from investigative news to reality shows featuring Maori people like Maori Cops. And in the image here, they do Romeo and Juliet in Te Reo, the Maori language. So it's been translated and is broadcast across the entire nation so that other people have some sort of sense of what's going on in indigenous communities. It's right there on the dial. It's not something that you have to go searching for. It's there. They've got billboards. It's part of the overall makeup of the broadcasting system in New Zealand. And finally, another one is looking at Aboriginal People's Television Network. Here you can see a promotional thing from a show called Mohawk Girls, which is essentially the indigenous answer to Sex and the City up there. So they have amazing programming, Sesame Street, a style of Sesame Street up there. They have shows like this. They have television news. They have a lot of robust programming that really shows how indigenous people are living very modern lives and building very creative bridges to their historical past in a way that's not feathers and leathers and horses and horseback. And almost in none of these images I've shown you here would you necessarily be able to identify any of these people as indigenous people. They're just people. And that's that's really the most important here, because when it comes down to looking at indigenous people and trying to do some reporting in those communities, when you kind of fall into these stereotypes that, the drunks or the feathers or anything like that, when you look at those 4Ds, when you look at those victims and warriors and whatnot, the problem here is that it turns into a sort of situation where you're looking at those people, like those people have some, some pretty serious problems. Those people are, kind of, they live out in the middle of nowhere and they do weird things. And that reminds us also of that Indian problem that's also been kind of sewn into that American fabric that's been been solved through genocide, assimilation, etc. Is that by making people as something other than yourself, it's very easy to forget about them and marginalize them. And while it has been a problem in the U.S. to not recognize indigenous people as having more than one dimension, media certainly is not helping with that at all. As a matter of fact, because media outlets remain Indian-free zones, I am of the opinion that these don't become institutions of justice, they become institutions of power, because you are keeping a particular power dynamic in place by refusing to look at indigenous populations as anything other than the historical sort of framework that you want to work with. So with that in mind as well, is that it's almost a very colonial way of reporting in indigenous communities. So when you've got your Mr. Looks Twice there, that's lives in a trailer and he dances and he knows all the steps and he can do all the Indian stuff that we're really familiar with. It doesn't exactly help when we've got this sort of collective colonial amnesia here in the U.S. and that there's a particular backstory as to why Mr. Looks Twice might have to be living in some crap trailer out in the middle of nowhere. There are very particular reasons for these things, and it's really important to kind of keep that in mind when you're reporting and when you're taking a look at this stuff. So. And again, the problem with this sort of colonial amnesia and refusal to look at backstories is it does lessen the value of people, and it makes it really, really, really easy for individuals who don't want to have to engage in that kind of history to really codify that into ways that are really, really disturbing for Native people. It's really easy to turn this into something and make this kind of acceptable because you know what, these guys are kind of weird anyway, and they're dying and they're disappearing and they're drunk and they dance around and do feathers and that kind of thing. I mean, this is the kind of sort of offshoot of this kind of poor reporting for the most part. When you're out reporting, and we will talk about this a little bit more through the week, there are a lot of things that you can do in your journalism to make sure that you're doing real and original stories. When you want to get away from those kind of stereotypes, there are some fantastic stories. I know in my career, I don't think I've ever had anybody on a horse in any of my stories, and I don't think I've had anybody ever wear feathers or anything like that. Mainly because the experience is so much different when you're looking at communities outside of the prearranged stereotypes that you have. And for some reason, when it comes to reporting in Indian country, reporters seem to sort of lose their objectivity or something. They hit the border of a reservation and suddenly it's just like, poof, I'm going to see these like ancient people that are out there on horseback. Yeah, I have no idea why. I know some really, really smart reporters out there that as soon as they get into like a Native community, it was major brain fart kind of a thing. And I was just kind of like, what are you guys thinking? Like, you're really smart, really talented. I mean, as journalists, we do our best to be very objective and to tell the truth. And for some reason, the truth for a lot of journalists, I think, is those kind of stereotypes there, the kind of stuff that we've seen before. And I guess what I'm really talking about here is that when you're out reporting, you really need to think about sort of like decolonizing media, decolonizing how you're thinking about people. It's the way that media often treats Native issues and people wouldn't fly in any other community. And again, I've never been quite clear as to why. Maybe one big reason is that when you have to deal with indigenous issues and all of this context and this information, it brings up a lot of painful stuff for a lot of people. Brings up a history of this country that I think a lot of people would rather forget than have to deal with. So there's a lot of stuff that gets tangled up into this. And, honestly, you don't want to be doing the same sort of John Ford Western that's already been done. As I mentioned with Pine Ridge Reservation, everybody goes to the Pine Ridge Reservation. Everybody here, don't go to the Pine Ridge Reservation unless you have a really good reason. You've got to have an excellent reason to go there. As a matter of fact, it was a policy at Jazeera America when I worked there that we would not take any stories from Pine Ridge Reservation unless they had a really good reason. Like that was the deal. We had to push those reporters to get out and do something different with their reporting. And that was important, and that's one of the reasons that we had such good coverage, I want to say, and had such a good track record with reporting in Indian country. When you're out there reporting, again, we'll talk about little tips and stuff here and there as we go through the week. But I wanted to play just one more video here. Another don't is that it's really great to get out there and do this kind of work, but you have to kind of be careful. And this is a TED Talk. We're not going to watch the whole thing, but just a little bit.
I'm here today to show my photographs of the Lakota. Now, many of you may have heard of the Lakota, or at least the larger group of tribes called the Sioux. The Lakota are one of many tribes that were moved off their land to prisoner of war camps, now called reservations. The Pine Ridge Reservation, the subject of today's slideshow, is located about 75 miles southeast of the Black Hills in South Dakota. It is sometimes referred to as Prisoner of War Camp number 334, and is where the Lakota now live. Now, if any of you have ever heard of AIM, the American Indian Movement, or of Russell Means, or Leonard Peltier, or of the standoff at Oglala, then you know that Pine Ridge is ground zero for Native issues in the U.S. So I've been asked to talk a little bit today about my relationship with the Lakota, and it's a very difficult one for me, because if you haven't noticed from my skin color, I'm white, and that is a huge barrier on a Native reservation. You'll see a lot of people in my photographs today, and I've become very close with them, and they welcome me like family. They've called me brother and uncle, and invited me again and again over 5 years. But on Pine Ridge, I will always be what is called Washichu. Washichu is a Lakota word that means non-Indian, but another version of this word means the one who takes the best meat for himself. And that's what I want to focus on, the one who takes the best part of the meat. It means greedy. So take a look around this auditorium today. We are at a private school in the American West, sitting in red velvet chairs with money in our pockets. And if we look at our lives, we have indeed taken the best part of the meat. So let's look today at a set of photographs of a people who lost so that we could gain. And know that when you see these people's faces, that these are not just images of Lakota. They stand for all indigenous people. On this piece of paper.
So, excuse my language here, but that's some Dances with Wolves bullshit. Like, I mean, the one thing that you really, really want to keep in mind is that, at some point, if you do go into this area or you do any sort of reporting here, is that you're being an invited guest. You don't get to come back and do a TED Talk about how you went and lived with the Indians. Like, there's other natives that are probably out there at the TED Talk, I'd like to think, they're sitting in red velvet chairs with money in their pocket. Yeah, a lot of us do sit in red velvet chairs and theaters and stuff, and a lot of us do have money in our pocket, and it's just, I have no idea how Ted went for this kind of crazy talk, but this is, again, one of Mr. Huey's photos. And when you think about even what we were talking about here with stereotypes, every single stereotype that you could possibly have was shown in the first 2 minutes of that talk, and the photos as well. Again, I think the bottom line that you want to keep in mind here when reporting in Indian country is that it's a really, really diverse place. And when you get away from those stereotypes and when you start thinking a lot differently about how you're going to approach your stories, you're going to find that there are tons and tons of great stories out there that don't match with the kind of stereotypes you're thinking of, which make even better stories because you're coming up with stuff that nobody else is coming up with. It's the Indian country is the kind of place where you can throw a microphone into a room and you're going to get a great story out of what happens in there because Indian people are really funny and interesting and doing all kinds of really great stuff. I said earlier today that I come from one of the most boring Native American families ever because my dad works for the airlines and my mom's a nurse and we don't own any horses and we don't even know how to ride horses and people are usually really let down when they ask what my background is. Yeah, I went to college. My parents went to college too. It's, they have houses. And it's always been sort of funny to have that conversation with people and they say, oh, okay, and it's great because I do like to leave people with a little bit of a sort of feeling when I'm talking to them, but that's always a really, really good one because people have preconceived notions about who we are and what we do. And when you can get past those, when you can get past those 4Ds and those warriors and everything else, you're going to find that you have some amazing stories that you can get out there in areas that nobody else goes to. And really do a lot of good work and good writing and do all the things that you wanted to do when you got into journalism. When you just start thinking a little bit differently and really kind of decolonizing how media work and how those images are sort of working in your mind. So, It's your turn. That's the bulk of the presentation. Again, we will talk a lot more about how to go about getting access to communities. We'll talk more about style in terms of writing and what you can avoid on very, very small levels here, because this is an area of expertise that takes a lot of work to kind of get into. But again, it's a very rewarding beat, and happy to answer any questions that you have about working in Indian country.
And we'll ask you to please ask the questions into the mic so we have this for the recording, because we have all our talks archived on our Vimeo channel.
Just a real quick question. You use the phrase Indian country repeatedly. You're not speaking about a geographic designation, or are you?
Yeah, I mean, that's a legal term. So Indian country is a federally legal term to describe an area where Native people are. So I use the term Indian country, at least here in the U.S., because that's the legal term. I mean, you can go other ways with like indigenous territories or other appropriate descriptions, but Indian country is a legal term that we use.
Well, but you spoke of 60% of the population living outside of reservations.
Mm-hmm.
So help us understand approaching a community that has those distinctions in where they live geographically and how we think about them as because part of what I hear you saying is reservations aren't the whole story.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of a geographic question.
Yeah, I mean, it's finding people in the community, in your city, that are indigenous. I mean, there are plenty of community groups all across the nation that you'll find. You'll find organizations working in your town. You'll find meetups. I mean, there are a lot of different ways to plug into to these communities, and it's just finding them and listening and sort of getting a sense of what those stories that you want to do are going to come from there. But a lot of time that's just going there, introducing yourself, and showing genuine interest. So Native communities don't always respond very well when you call with a breaking news situation because they don't know you. So, but if this is something that you were hoping to do and you're developing your sources as a reporter, you're going to have people on your Rolodex that you can call and that know who you are. But when you call up last minute breaking news or something, it doesn't really work too well. So that's kind of part of the process.
So you said that you've gotten interviewed like a few times, right? That's what you said?
I guess, yeah, I have been.
So do you feel like the majority of interviews with like Native Americans, do you feel like that they're trying to find like a sad story? Yes,
in short, yeah. When I talk to photographers that I've worked with that have done similar work with other reporters, when I've talked to reporters, when I see the work, I mean, I think it's pretty clear if you just kind of Google Native American in the news section, you're going to find a lot of depressing stories and, quite frankly, sort of boring stories because they're not really all that new. So, yeah, I mean, I think reporters, there are a number of organizations that send their reporters out with a thesis or a hypothesis that they're going to prove, not one that they're actually going to question or check.
You showed us a lot of great don'ts, and by great, I mean terrible ones. What are some good do's and resources where we can find some more accurate depictions of stories? Because I've tried researching this, and even Netflix does not have a great assortment of documentaries. It's really hard to find stuff.
Right. When it comes to dues, again, it's really being engaged. I mean, these are communities that have been essentially screwed over by everybody who shows up, from reporters to government officials to photographers to everybody. I mean, a lot of, not all, but a lot of communities are very guarded against who comes in because it's so, it's just expected that you're going to be exploited. You know, I'm surprised Pine Ridge even lets reporters out there anymore. Honestly, they're just, there are so many bad stories that come out there, but the dues are to kind of, you know, plug in, pay attention, do your research, read some books, like, you know, I mean, like you would do with any other beat, really, or any other thing that you were researching, is that you want to dig deeper than that surface level, those surface level stereotypes, so you can kind of get to what's going on, what's really important to those communities. So when it comes to research, yeah, Netflix is kind of horrible for that kind of stuff. But you know, I mean, there are fabulous books and documentaries that are out there. It just takes a little bit of research, and if you want after, I can direct you in a few places if you're interested. So, but there are some resources. Native American Journalists Association, we have a bunch of stuff up there. Reporting in Indigenous communities is a great resource out of Canada on how to report you know, Indian country news. And then, of course, if there's 100 Questions, 500 Nations, which is a book that we put out a couple of years ago that kind of answers some really basic questions about reporting in Indian country. Some definitions, it's a very small, quick guide that you can check out to sort of, if you've got a question about something, it's probably in there for the really basic stuff. So.
Thank you.
Hi, Tristan. I just wanted to thank you for a really thoughtful and thought-provoking talk. And I was struck by the talk today because just this morning I watched a video from Democracy Now! Who was they were on the front lines reporting the Dakota Access Pipeline. And I found myself becoming very moved by this footage because, I mean, there were people being attacked by dogs. And now that I think about it in the context of your own presentation, that coverage at the same time does reinforce many of the same frames that you've been talking about. The warrior, people on horses, all this sort of stuff. You had the white journalist Amy Goodman going in and getting the kind of front lines reporting. And given this lack of access to Native peoples in sort of mainstream news, I was very thankful that this video existed, and yet it's still, I'm kind of struggling with the fact that these same frames existed. So I'm wondering if you can talk about if the deployment of those frames are beneficial in certain circumstances. I think there is a tremendously interesting story to be told there. Or if you know, the story should have been more engaged and ongoing at the same time rather than focusing on this singular event.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen the videos as well, and you know, there's a huge story going on up there, and I think, I mean, it complicates matters because, as I said, with this sort of warrior idea, is that again, there are a lot of very, very smart people out there that know that they're going to be able to pull in media coverage by doing that. Not to say that there aren't people that ride horses up there. I mean, it's North Dakota, it's a farming community, people do that. But you know, it's a very complicated picture when you have groups of people that want media attention and know how to kind of pull that media attention in. And you also have media organizations or for instance, Democracy Now!, which I feel does have an agenda. And when it comes to Democracy Now!'s coverage of Indigenous issues, I mean, for all of their sort of lefty, like fight the power sort of stuff, they don't go out there. Like, they don't go to Native communities to report. I mean, it's usually only when it's something that sort of meets their agenda, I feel like. So it's interesting that Amy Goodman would go out there and actually do that story and show that. But, you know, I mean, it's easy to get into a story very quickly when you've got something that you can identify with, or something that, you know, that's interesting and new, or, you know, there's all kind of ways that you can get into a story. Those leads are incredibly important. But playing with that imagery and, you know, really playing it up, yeah, you have to wonder what's going on, A, on the production side, and B, what's going on with the protesters, and where those two are kind of coming together and one is sort of taking advantage of the other. Because the big question is, who is really taking advantage of who when you've got this sort of portrayal in media that we're going to have to keep dealing with here, but also people who are feeding into that because they need that media attention. So it becomes very complicated very quickly with that. And but I do hope that more journalists are going up there and doing good stories out there, because it's an incredibly important thing that's going on out there, and there hasn't been nearly enough good media coverage as far as I'm concerned.
I have a question back to the example you showed of the New York Times coverage. You mentioned you were working as a reporter for public radio at the time. Can you share an example of a story you produced while you were there that was not perpetuating a stereotype versus kind of this parachuting in version that the New York Times did?
I'd like to think all of mine were not that much. There were some really great ways that you could really interact with the community. One of my favorites was during the whole when the EPA was releasing their report on fracking up there. I'm sure many of you have seen Gasland, and how people can kind of light their faucets on fire and stuff. That was up in Pavilion, Wyoming, which is inside the Wind River Reservation. During that time, there was obviously a lot of political turmoil going back and forth about whether fracking was good or bad or whatever. And one of my favorite stories we did was that Representative Cynthia Lummis made this presentation to Congress about how the Indians in Wyoming used to call that area bad water. So clearly it's not the fracking. It's definitely not the fracking. So I called up the language teacher over there and said, "Is that accurate?" And they said, "Well, let me talk to the elders. Let me do everything." And they came back and said, "No, that's always been Sheep Springs. We don't know where bad water would come from." And it was always one of my favorite stories there, because it was like, "No, well, we actually talked to the Indians, and they said no, that's not true." So there was these really fun ways that you could use that sort of knowledge and that community knowledge to really do some really great reporting. And it's a small story, but it felt really good to call out the senator by actually calling the Indians. So I think, though, when breaking that one of those stereotypes was that one of my favorites that we did was it was a 1-hour investigative documentary into a uranium mill that used to be on the Wind River. And in 2010, floods had hit the reservation. Everything got flooded. Disaster and stuff. But afterwards, what scientists were finding was that there was really high levels of uranium and other poisons that had basically seeped up out of this area that had flooded. So we took a look and figured out that there had been this uranium mine that had been out, or uranium mill that had been out there. And they had essentially just thrown all the tailings out for years. So they'd never buried them. Everything had just leached into the soil. So it was this huge radioactive area. Instead of just like this environmental sort of justice story that was going on, we asked how the uranium mill got out there in the first place, which took us down this massive, 1-year investigation into trying to figure out how the federal government had allowed that mill to get out there, and tracked down the guy who was there and who was the landowner. He was in his late 80s, basically. Found him, and he said, "Oh yeah, I remember these guys basically showed up and told me to get off my land, and the police came and they removed us." I was like, "Okay, this is interesting. We should check this out." Ended up in the archives, ended up in the land offices. We had to reconstruct the story of the land all the way from the 1800s to the present to sort of figure that story out. Figured out that there was a lot of weird stuff that had happened, tons of just weird stuff around this whole land transfer. But the crown jewel was actually finding the guy that he claimed had moved them out, in a nursing home. He was 90 years old or something, and he was like, yeah, I remember, we moved them out. And I did this all over the reservation, because we would usually just trade money out and trade booze or whatever to get people off of their land so we could put white people onto it. And just all of a sudden it's like, holy crap, this isn't a singular problem. This is a reservation-wide problem. We just didn't have the resources to go pump in there and find every single one of these that had happened. But we were really proud that we could take that sort of historical story, that sort of almost family folklore, and pretty much prove that the guy wasn't, just some crazy old kook out there saying the feds moved me off my land. We've got all the documentation and the paperwork there. And the next question is, what do you do about it? Because there's statute of limitations, and this family is old, and that piece of land is not going to be inhabitable ever. So.
One
want to raise a practical scenario. What kind of advice would you give a reporter, and let's make it an intern, who's assigned to cover the powwow? And that's an event where there's certain things. There's drumming, there's dancing. It can be amazingly emotional. But what would you say to that intern if she's attempting to report a credible story on that event?
I mean, I'd have to ask what that credible story is, because I wouldn't send anybody to cover a powwow. It's not news. It kind of, I think, falls under the sort of like ceremonial thing, that it's these interesting people that are doing this weird sort of thing. What I would tell an intern would be to go to the powwow and not report on it. Meet some people, get plugged into that community, learn about what's happening, come back and tell me what you find. So, I mean, I cannot think of a single, off the top of my head, I can't think of a single story that I could report from a powwow, and I've been to a lot of them. So, yeah.
Oh, hello. My name's Hannah. Yeah, thank you for coming here and speaking. I have a question. There's a definite line here that can't be crossed. You know, like as you said, the 4 Ds. But some of those things are just, it's kind of hard to avoid. You know, the, tragedy in natives, it pairs so well. And it exists. I mean, it's hard to find a native that hasn't been touched by those harsh things that we deal with, those stereotypical instances. But where do you draw the line of saying, yes, it exists, but it doesn't hinder us completely? Because there's tons of modern natives that are trying to thrive or are thriving. Where is that line to be drawn to say, yeah, this is an existing problem, it's a element in our life, but we're able to succeed? Like, where is that line?
I mean, yeah, those statistics and everything that I talked about, they're out there and they exist. But unless there's something new, like, your editors are always going to ask you what's new about this story. You're going to get that question all the time when it comes to your work, no matter what you're covering. If somebody else has done it, they're going to say what's new. The only difference is with like covering Indian country is that most editors don't know what's new. So it's really easy to just slide in something that's already been done before. However, when it comes to kind of that line, yeah, I mean, give me something new. Tell me something, those violence against women statistics, tell me something new about them, and we'll talk about it, we'll report on it. But, for me, when something like this is coming up, when those statistics, when new stats are out from Department of Justice or something, yeah, it does raise to the level of a story. But like, how is it different? How is it new? I just, I mean, unavoidably you're going to report stories at some point in your career that have already been done. But nobody wants to do the same story that 100 other people have done. I mean, that's, you can reblog that and be done with it. Like, who cares, So, yeah, again, the Pine Ridge thing. Like, don't go out to Pine Ridge. Everybody does it, so.
Hi. Just now you mentioned the Pine Ridge Reservation. Is there a reason why everyone goes to the Pine Ridge Reservation, or is it because it's hard to access the other tribes? And if you're going to approach them, like, how do you go approach them? Like, what is like the proper way of approaching a tribe which is not like a common tribe?
Yeah, first the Pine Ridge stuff, I think it's just because it's really easy to throw those, again, all those stereotypes. There is poverty there. There are all of the problems we talked about with these stereotypes. They're there. And, it makes for great images to have, trash in people's yards and third world conditions and stuff. But why people keep going, I don't know. I think they're just lazy, honestly. When it comes to approaching different groups around the country, I mean, again, it's really it's really not different than any other reporting that you would ever do. When you're reporting in, the African American community, when you're reporting in the LGBTQ community, you're finding people and you're talking to them and you're turning them into sources, And, that it's the same with this stuff too. It's just showing up and being open and being able to talk to folks about what's going on in their community and what's important to them. I mean, that's a question I think that a lot of reporters don't ever ask. Is like, what's going on in your community that I should know about? And you get some great stuff then. Like, who knew if you just asked? Like, it'd be given stories. But I mean, it's again, for the most part, I think the thing to keep in mind with reporting in Indian country is don't treat this differently than you would in any other of your reporting, any other bit of your reporting. It's all, the same rules apply, It's just that you've kind of got to get past a lot of these built-in stereotypes that have been sort of perpetuated over the years. But when it comes to reporting, you do your job and it's basically the same everywhere. So.
Tristan, as an African-American male, I can really relate to a lot of what you're talking about here. My question, though, goes back to kind of what Caesar was asking you. When you look at what is written and how it's written, you talked about reporters, but you didn't talk about editors, the folks who are making the decisions to produce a lot of this. And I think that it's important for our young folks to understand and hear how editors, what their role is in all of this, because there is that culpability. I was wondering, can you talk about the role of editors and the lack of editors who are of color making the decisions about what goes into what kind of publication? Thanks.
I mean, once you are doing your work, you're going to run into a lot of editors. A lot of them are not so good. Some of them are fantastic. But there's a lack of editors that are people of color. So that's going to continue to be an issue for anybody who's wanting to expand their coverage. But I think actually the most important thing to remember when you're dealing with editors, whether you're freelance or you're on staff, is that you gotta stick to your guns on this stuff. If you don't feel comfortable with doing it, or you know better, and the editor doesn't, because sometimes the editor doesn't know, you've got to really stick to it and say I'm not comfortable with doing that. I don't want to start the story with a drunk Indian on the side of the road. I'm not going to do that. I do this all the time with editors. Usually I feel like I'm training them to work with me instead of the other way around, which I'm fine with. Editors are going to ask you for a lot of weird stuff sometimes. They just, a lot of these folks have been cooped up in offices in New York City for, the last 7 years and, have no idea there's anything past New Jersey kind of a thing, I had an editor once, I was working on a story on veterans for this veterans series. One of the editors asked if we could find a Native veteran who had lost a leg and something like had PTSD. I can't remember now. They had this really, really specific image of what they wanted. It was like, no, that's, it was basically, it was basically me saying, yeah, I'll work on that. I'll work on that. And hang up the phone. They're like, no, I'm not going to do that. When the story came back, they were happy with it. And later in the day, they were like, we're really sorry we asked you for that. Thank you, appreciate it. You weren't going to get it anyway, but that's cool. So I think when dealing with editors, you've got to be independent. You've got to do what you have to do for your work to really shine. Because the other thing that I forgot to mention with the New York Times article is that the entire community came together on Wind River to put together a video pushing back against that reporter. They called that reporter out in every possible way that they could publicly. And granted, not a ton of people saw it, but I don't think it's ever good if you go into a community, do some work, and you have the entire reservation get together and make a video about, how you were a jerk. Like that's, nobody wants that ever. And that is one of the things that happened on Wind River with that particular piece is that, I don't think the Times has been back out there since then. And there have been some really good stories that have happened out there. I'm not sure if people just didn't want to talk to them or not, but, you don't want that to happen, so.
Before we wrap up, Professor Barber is going to tell us about our next CAMS talk.
The next CAMS talk is on Thursday, September 29th at 4 p.m. Yeah, it's Ryan Chittum, who was one of the reporters who worked on the Panama Papers. You may be familiar with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. He particularly worked on the Iceland part of the Panama Papers, which the Iceland Prime Minister then stepped down as a result of that work. And but also, he's part of Columbia Journalism Review, and previous to that, the Wall Street Journal. So he'll be here to talk about investigative reporting, something that I think is pretty fun. Maybe that's me.
All right. Well, thank you, Carrie. Before we thank Tristan, just to note, he'll be here through Friday morning. So if any of you would like to have an opportunity to speak with him individually about projects you might be working on or with any questions, feel free to get in touch with me and we can make that connection. There's still a couple of windows in the schedule where we could plug that in. So with that, thanks everyone for coming, and Tristan, thanks very much for